Tension suffocated. Courtroom 4. Cold sweat dripped down Donovan's face. Handcuffs bit into his wrists. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed. A callous strike from a sworn officer. Gasps erupted. Silence followed. Then, heavy boots thudded against hardwood. Someone stepped through heavy oak doors, carrying righteous fury and federal authority. The air inside the Oak Creek County Courthouse was stale, smelling of floor wax, old paper, and quiet desperation. For 17-year-old Donovan Hayes, the wooden chair at the defense table felt like a death row bench. He sat rigid, his shoulders hunched, trying to make himself as small as possible in his oversized, county-issued orange jumpsuit. The heavy metal chains connecting his wrists to his waist clinked softly with his every shaky breath, a metallic reminder of a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Donovan was an honor roll student. He ran track, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and spent his weekends working at a hardware store to save up for college applications. He had never been in trouble. He had never even received a detention, but in the eyes of the Oak Creek criminal justice system, none of that mattered. To them, he was just another statistic. A young black man accused of grand theft auto, aggravated assault on a police officer, and resisting arrest. Sitting a few feet away, radiating an aura of untouchable arrogance, was the architect of Donovan's nightmare, Officer Arthur Pendleton. Pendleton was a 20-year veteran of the Oak Creek Police Department, a man whose reputation preceded him in the worst possible ways. Broad-shouldered, with a thick neck and cold, pale eyes, Pendleton operated under the belief that his badge was a crown. In the poorer neighborhoods of Oak Creek, he was known as a menace, a cop who routinely violated civil rights, planted evidence when it suited him, and used excessive force without a second thought. Yet, thanks to a deeply entrenched network of cronyism, a complicit union representative named Thomas Briggs, and an apathetic internal affairs division, Pendleton's file remained spotless. The night of the arrest had been a Tuesday. Donovan was driving his uncle's meticulously restored 1998 Honda Civic back from a late shift at the hardware store. Pendleton had pulled him over for a supposedly busted taillight, a taillight Donovan knew for a fact was fully functional. Within seconds of rolling down his window, the situation had escalated. Pendleton hadn't asked for a license and registration. He had demanded Donovan step out of the vehicle. When Donovan politely asked why, Pendleton yanked him through the open door, slammed him face first into the wet asphalt, and ground his knee into the teenager's spine. "Stop resisting, boy," Pendleton had hissed into Donovan's ear, though Donovan was completely paralyzed by fear and pain. By the time the backup arrived, Pendleton had crafted a flawless narrative. The suspect had tried to flee, had taken a swing at an officer, and the vehicle was suspected to be stolen. Now, 3 weeks later, the preliminary hearing was underway. The presiding magistrate, Judge Constance Rutherford, was a stern woman nearing retirement. She peered over her reading glasses, looking annoyed by the slow pace of the morning's docket. Donovan's public defender, Simon Caldwell, was a well-meaning but hopelessly overworked attorney carrying a caseload of over 100 active files. He looked exhausted, his tie slightly askew, shuffling through a disorganized stack of manila folders. "The state calls Officer Arthur Pendleton to the stand," announced Gregory Sterling, the sharp-suited, aggressive prosecutor who treated every conviction as a stepping stone for his political career. Pendleton sauntered to the witness stand, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He placed his left hand on the Bible, raised his right, and swore to tell the truth with practiced ease. Settling into the chair, he adjusted his uniform, making sure the gold shield on his chest caught the harsh, fluorescent light of the courtroom. For the next 45 minutes, Pendleton spun a web of absolute fiction. He spoke with the calm, authoritative cadence of a seasoned professional. He detailed how Donovan's vehicle matched the description of a stolen car in the area. He described, with feigned solemnity, how Donovan had become immediately combative and belligerent upon being stopped. The suspect lunged at me. "Your Honor," Pendleton lied smoothly, looking directly at the judge. "He grabbed my utility belt." I feared for my life and the safety of the public. I had no choice but to utilize physical force to subdue him. Donovan felt his chest tighten. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He's lying, Donovan whispered frantically to Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, he's lying. He dragged me out. I didn't do anything. Keep your voice down, Donovan, Caldwell muttered, barely glancing up from his notes. Let me cross-examine him. Don't make a scene. But the cross-examination was a disaster. Caldwell fumbled his questions, failing to point out the inconsistencies in Pendleton's police report. He didn't ask why the dashcam footage from Pendleton's cruiser had conveniently malfunctioned that night. He didn't press the officer on the fact that the Honda Civic was legally registered to Donovan's uncle. Pendleton parried Caldwell's weak inquiries with arrogant ease, often directing condescending smiles toward the defense table. The injustice of it all began to crush Donovan. His entire future college, his career, his life was being systematically destroyed by a man sitting 20 feet away, lying under oath without a single bead of sweat on his forehead. Judge Rutherford sighed, tapping her pen against her desk. Officer Pendleton, you may step down and return to the prosecution's table. Let's take a brief 10-minute recess before we hear the defense's motion for bail. The courtroom relaxed slightly. The judge looked down at a fresh stack of documents. The bailiff stepped out into the hallway. Caldwell turned his back to Donovan to rummage through his briefcase. Pendleton stepped down from the witness stand. But instead of walking directly to the prosecutor's table, he took a deliberate detour. He walked right past the defense table, his heavy utility belt brushing against the wooden edge near where Donovan sat. Donovan looked up. His eyes met Pendleton's. The teenager's eyes were filled with tears of frustration, but also a sudden, desperate spark of defiance. You know you're ruining my life, Donovan whispered, his voice trembling but clear enough for the officer to hear. You know I didn't do anything. You're a liar. Pendleton stopped dead in his tracks. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, ugly scowl. He leaned down, his face inches from Donovan's, invading his personal space. He reeked of stale coffee and cheap aftershave. You listen to me, you little punk, Pendleton hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous register. Nobody calls me a liar. You're going to prison, and nobody is going to care about one more thug off the streets. I'm not a thug, Donovan retorted, leaning away from the officer's oppressive presence. And you're a corrupt, racist coward. Something snapped behind Pendleton's pale eyes. The veneer of the disciplined officer vanished entirely, exposing the violent bully beneath. Driven by a decade of unchecked power and absolute impunity, Pendleton didn't think about the cameras, the witnesses, or his oath. He raised his right hand and brought it down across Donovan's face with vicious, explosive force. Crack. The sound of the open-handed slap echoed off the high, paneled ceilings of courtroom 4 like a gunshot. The force of the blow snapped Donovan's head violently to the side. Because his hands were chained to his waist, he couldn't break his momentum, and he tumbled out of his heavy wooden chair, crashing onto the hard linoleum floor. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Prosecutor Sterling dropped his pen. Caldwell froze, his mouth hanging open. Judge Rutherford's head snapped up from her paperwork, her eyes wide with shock. For 3 agonizing seconds, the courtroom was plunged into dead, horrified silence. Donovan lay on the floor, his ears ringing, the metallic taste of blood pooling in his mouth from where his teeth had cut into his inner lip. Pendleton stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest puffed out. He adjusted his duty belt, trying to quickly mask his loss of control with an air of authority. Suspect was becoming aggressive. Pendleton barked into the silence, looking up at the stunned judge. He tried to spit on me. I was subduing a threat. Officer Pendleton! Judge Rutherford finally found her voice, slamming her gavel down instinctively. What in God's name are you doing? Stand down immediately. He was hostile, Your Honor. Pendleton doubled down, pointing a thick finger at the bleeding teenager on the floor. Donovan struggled to sit up, the heavy chains rattling against the floorboards. Tears of pain and deep, profound humiliation streamed down his face. He looked at the gallery, at the judge, at his useless lawyer. He was completely alone, or so he thought. Just as Pendleton reached down, intending to roughly haul Donovan back into his chair by the collar of his jumpsuit, the heavy, brass-handled oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. The doors didn't just open. They were violently shoved apart, hitting the wall stops with a heavy thud that made everyone in the room jump. A man stepped over the threshold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying, predatory grace. He wore a sharply tailored, dark charcoal suit that looked out of place in the dreary county courthouse. But it wasn't the suit that commanded the room's attention. It was the sheer, suffocating intensity radiating from him. His eyes were locked dead onto Officer Arthur Pendleton. This was Richard Hayes. To the local police of Oak Creek, the name Richard Hayes meant nothing. To the criminal underworld across the eastern seaboard, however, it meant terror. Richard was the special agent in charge, SAC, of the FBI's regional field office, specializing in deep-cover organized crime infiltration, and, more recently, the Division of Civil Rights and Public Corruption. For the past 14 months, Richard had been completely off the grid, operating deep undercover in a federal sting operation 3 states away. He hadn't been allowed to contact his family. He hadn't known his son was arrested until he surfaced 48 hours ago, debriefed, and turned his personal phone back on to find dozens of frantic voicemails from his brother. He had driven through the night, breaking every speed limit, driven by a father's frantic terror. He had walked into the courthouse just in time to look through the small glass window of the courtroom doors. He had seen the slap. He had seen his son fall. Richard's heavy dress shoes clicked methodically against the hardwood aisle as he marched toward the front of the courtroom. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The bailiff, who had rushed back in upon hearing the commotion, stepped forward to intercept the newcomer, placing a hand on his holster. "Sir, you can't come in here past the gallery," the bailiff warned. Richard didn't even break his stride. Without looking at the bailiff, he reached inside his suit jacket. The bailiff tensed, but Richard smoothly produced a genuine leather credential case, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming gold shield and a federal identification card. Special Agent Richard Hayes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Richard's voice was a low, rumbling baritone that carried easily across the silent room. "Stand down, deputy." The bailiff took one look at the federal badge and instantly backed away, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. Judge Rutherford, recovering from her initial shock, leaned over her bench. "Agent Hayes? This is an active preliminary hearing. What is the meaning of this interruption?" Richard didn't answer her immediately. He walked right past the wooden partition that separated the gallery from the court floor. He bypassed the prosecutor's table. He walked straight toward Arthur Pendleton, who was still standing near the defense table. Pendleton, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, puffed out his chest and rested his hand on his duty belt. "Hey, Fed, this is local jurisdiction. You're interfering with a secured prisoner." Richard stopped exactly 2 feet away from Pendleton. Up close, the FBI agent was a head taller than the corrupt cop. Richard looked down at the bleeding teenager on the floor. He saw the swelling red mark shaped like a handprint across Donovan's cheek. He saw the split lip. He saw the tears in his son's eyes. Donovan looked up, his jaw dropping in disbelief. "Dad?" he choked out, his voice cracking. The word dropped into the courtroom like a live grenade. Pendleton froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His eyes darted from the boy on the floor to the federal agent towering over him. The resemblance was undeniable. The same sharp jawline, the same deep brown eyes. "Dad?" Pendleton whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Richard slowly turned his gaze back to Pendleton. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was an absolute, cold-blooded promise of destruction. "Step away from my son," Richard commanded. His voice wasn't a yell. It was dangerously quiet, but it vibrated with a lethal authority. Pendleton took a clumsy step backward, his boots squeaking against the linoleum. He was hostile. I am a sworn officer of the Oak Creek. You, Richard interrupted, his voice slicing through Pendleton's stuttering defense, are a suspect in a federal civil rights investigation. As of exactly 10 seconds ago, Richard turned his back on the trembling cop and immediately knelt on the floor beside Donovan. The imposing, terrifying federal agent melted away, replaced entirely by a heartbroken father. He reached out with trembling hands, gently touching the unbruised side of Donovan's face. "I'm here, D," Richard whispered, pulling a clean handkerchief from his pocket and pressing it gently to his son's bleeding lip. "I've got you. I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm right here now." He lied. "Dad," Donovan sobbed quietly, the emotional dam finally breaking now that he was safe. "I didn't do anything. He dragged me out of Uncle Ray's car. I didn't fight him." "I know, son. I know," Richard said softly. He looked up at Simon Caldwell, the public defender, who was staring at the scene in absolute shock. "Get the bailiff to unlock these chains right now." Caldwell nodded furiously and gestured to the bailiff, who hurried over with his keys. Judge Rutherford cleared her throat, clearly out of her depth. "Agent Hayes, while I understand the personal nature of this situation, this is still my courtroom, and your son is still facing felony charges under state law." Richard stood up, helping Donovan into his chair. He turned to face the bench. He smoothed his tie, his demeanor shifting back from father to special agent in charge. "Your Honor," Richard addressed the judge, his tone respectful but unyielding. "What you just witnessed was a violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You saw a sworn police officer commit a battery against a handcuffed, restrained minor in a court of law. I saw an altercation." Prosecutor Sterling objected weakly, standing up. "Agent Hayes, you can't just walk in here and—" "Sit down, counselor," Richard snapped, fixing the prosecutor with a glare that made Sterling drop back into his chair instantly. Richard turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, prior to walking into this courtroom, I pulled the dispatch logs and the impound reports regarding my son's arrest. The vehicle in question was never reported stolen. Furthermore, I have a signed affidavit from a civilian witness who recorded the entire traffic stop from their second-story apartment window footage that conveniently proves Officer Pendleton initiated an unprovoked physical assault on my son." Pendleton swayed on his feet. He looked like he was going to vomit. That's a lie. That's doctored evidence." Richard didn't even look at him. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed a number, putting it on speakerphone and setting it on the— "Zach Hayes," a crisp, professional voice echoed from the phone. "Team 1, this is Hayes," Richard spoke clearly. "I am currently in courtroom 4 of the Oak Creek County Courthouse. I need federal marshals and my tactical unit down here immediately." "Copy that, boss. We're in the lobby. ETA 30 seconds. The courtroom descended into absolute chaos. Judge Rutherford slammed her gavel, not to restore order, but to try and process the sheer magnitude of what was happening. Pendleton looked toward the doors, a wild, cornered look in his eyes. He took a step toward the exit. "Don't even think about it, Arthur," Richard said, finally turning back to the cop. He didn't use a title. He stripped the man of his badge with just his tone. "If you take one more step toward those doors, I will drop you to the floor and cuff you myself. And I promise you, I will not be nearly as gentle as you were with my son." Pendleton froze, trapped between the fury of a federal agent and the rapidly approaching sound of heavy tactical boots echoing down the courthouse hallway. Karma hadn't just knocked on Pendleton's door. It had kicked it off its hinges, and it was carrying a federal badge. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4 didn't just open this time. They were violently secured open by 4 heavily armed agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Clad in olive drab tactical gear with bold yellow FBI lettering across their ballistic vests, they flooded the aisles. The synchronized Heavy thud of their boots on the hardwood was the drumbeat of Arthur Pendleton's impending doom. "Secure the room. Nobody moves," shouted Supervisory Special Agent William Decker, a grizzled 25-year veteran of the Bureau who had mentored Richard Hayes. Decker's eyes swept the courtroom, locking onto the bleeding teenager and then moving to the pale, trembling police officer. Pendleton's hands hovered instinctively near his duty belt, a muscle memory born of 20 years on the streets. "Keep your hands exactly where I can see them, officer," Decker barked, unholstering his weapon just enough to make his point clear. "Move them away from that belt. Interlace your fingers behind your head and drop to your knees." Now, for a fraction of a second, the arrogant bully inside Pendleton wanted to resist. He was a veteran cop. He owned these streets. But as he looked at the 4 federal agents forming a perimeter, and then at Richard Hayes, whose cold, unblinking stare promised absolute violence if he flinched, the fight drained out of him entirely. Pendleton sank to his knees. The heavy thud of his kneecaps hitting the linoleum echoed loudly in the stunned silence of the courtroom. Agent Decker stepped forward, swiftly stripping Pendleton of his service weapon, his taser, and his radio. He yanked the officer's arms down, pinning them behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of federal handcuffs, ratcheting tightly around Pendleton's wrists, sounded like a closing vault door. "Arthur Pendleton," Decker recited, his voice devoid of any emotion, "you are under arrest for the violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. You have the right to remain silent." As Decker read the Miranda warning, Prosecutor Gregory Sterling finally found his legs. He scrambled out from behind his table, his face flushed, waving his hands frantically. "Agent Hayes, you cannot do this," Sterling sputtered, panic bleeding into his voice. "This is a state matter. The defendant is in the middle of a preliminary hearing for felony assault and grand theft. You are disrupting the judicial process." Richard slowly stood up from his son's side. He turned to the ambitious prosecutor, his expression hardening into a mask of pure contempt. "Mr. Sterling," Richard said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "In the last 30 minutes, you knowingly presented perjured testimony. You failed to turn over exculpatory evidence, specifically the dashcam footage your office claimed was corrupted, which my cyber division pulled from your department's cloud server 2 hours ago. That is a Brady violation. When my team is finished dissecting your office, you'll be lucky if the state bar only strips your license, instead of putting you in a cell next to him." Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. All the political ambition drained from his eyes, replaced by the stark terror of a federal indictment. He backed away, collapsing into his chair. Judge Rutherford, visibly shaken by the rapid collapse of her courtroom's decorum and the blatant corruption exposed before her, hammered her gavel. "Order. I will have order." She took a shaky breath, looking down at the paperwork detailing Donovan's charges. Her eyes darted to the bruised and bleeding teenager, then to the handcuffed cop on the floor. Given the extraordinary circumstances, the undeniable evidence of police perjury, and the deplorable assault I just witnessed, the state's case has zero credibility. All charges against Donovan Hayes are dismissed with prejudice. Bailiff, remove those chains immediately. The bailiff, sweating profusely, rushed over to the defense table and unlocked the heavy iron cuffs around Donovan's waist and wrists. The heavy chains fell to the floor with a loud, final clatter. Donovan rubbed his raw wrists. He looked up at his father, the reality of his freedom crashing over him. Richard didn't care about the gallery, the judge, or the agents. He pulled his son into a tight, desperate embrace, burying his face in Donovan's shoulder. "It's over, D," Richard whispered fiercely, his voice finally cracking. "I've got you. Nobody is ever going to touch you again." Across the room, Agent Decker hauled Pendleton to his feet. The officer was trembling violently, his face flushed with humiliation. The gold shield on his chest, which he had polished so proudly that morning, now looked like a target. "Walk," Decker ordered. shoving Pendleton toward the center aisle. The perp walk out of the Oak Creek County Courthouse was a spectacle that would be burned into local history. By the time Decker and the tactical team led Pendleton through the main lobby, word had spread. Clerks, paralegals, and off-duty deputies lined the hallways, watching in stunned silence as the untouchable Arthur Pendleton was paraded out in federal irons. Local news crews, originally there to cover a high-profile mayoral press conference on the third floor, scrambled down the stairs, their cameras rolling. The flashing lights of the press cameras illuminated Pendleton's disgraced, downward-cast face as he was shoved into the back of an unmarked black SUV. The reign of terror was over. The reckoning had just begun. 3 days later, the Oak Creek Police Department was effectively under federal occupation. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit had moved in with the subtlety of a hurricane. Black SUVs lined the department's parking lot. Federal agents were boxing up decades of files, seizing computer servers, and conducting closed-door interviews that left veteran detectives sweating through their shirts. Donovan was resting at home, his split lip stitched and the swelling on his cheek fading into a dull purple bruise. Richard had officially recused himself from the direct prosecution of Pendleton to avoid any defense claims of a conflict of interest. But as the special agent in charge, he had handed the reins to his most ruthless investigator, Agent Decker, and a brilliant assistant United States attorney named Mitchell Harrison. The investigation quickly revealed that Arthur Pendleton's actions against Donovan weren't just the result of a racist power trip, they were part of a highly orchestrated, deeply entrenched criminal enterprise. The twist unraveled inside Interrogation Room B at the FBI field office. Pendleton sat at a steel table, wearing a drab gray federal detention jumpsuit. The arrogance that had defined his career was entirely eradicated. He looked 10 years older, the dark bags under his eyes, a testament to 3 sleepless nights in federal lockup. Agent Decker entered the room, dropping a massive cardboard box onto the table with a deafening slam. He didn't sit down. He just stared at the disgraced cop. "Let's talk about Clifford Barnaby," Decker said, his voice flat. Pendleton's head snapped up, genuine panic flashing in his pale eyes. I don't know who that is. Don't play stupid, Arthur. It doesn't suit you," Decker sighed, pulling a thick stack of transcripts from the box. Clifford Barnaby, owner of Apex Towing and Recovery, the man who handles all the police impounds for the East District. Decker began spreading 8x10 glossies across the table. They were surveillance photos. Pendleton meeting with Barnaby in dimly lit diners. Pendleton accepting thick manila envelopes. "You see, Arthur, we couldn't figure out why you pulled over a clean-cut kid in a perfectly legal 1998 Honda Civic. The taillight wasn't broken. He wasn't speeding. But then we looked at the car. It was fully restored. Pristine engine, custom exhaust, aftermarket rims. A tuner's dream." Decker leaned over the table, his face inches from Pendleton's. "You didn't pull Donovan Hayes over because he looked suspicious. You pulled him over because he was driving a $20,000 asset. You and Barnaby have been running a fraudulent asset forfeiture ring for 5 years. You target young, minority drivers who don't have the money for expensive lawyers. You provoke an altercation, charge them with assaulting an officer, and impound the vehicle as evidence in a felony crime." Pendleton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He remained silent, but his trembling hands betrayed him. Then Decker continued, tapping a finger on a bank ledger. "The district attorney's office, which we are currently tearing apart, drags the case out. The impound fees rack up when the families can't pay the thousands of dollars in fees. Barnaby forecloses on the mechanic's lien, takes legal possession of the cars, and ships them out of state to be stripped for parts or sold at private auctions. And you, Arthur, get a 20% kickback for providing the inventory." "I want a lawyer," Pendleton whispered weakly. "You have one. He's outside," Decker replied coldly. "But he can't save you. We have the wiretaps on Barnaby. The moment we raided his lot, he flipped on you faster than a cheap coin. He gave us everything." The ledgers, the text messages, the burner phones. Decker pulled out one final document and slid it across the table. It was a federal indictment spanning 42 pages. RICO violations, wire fraud, grand theft, deprivation of rights under color of law, witness tampering, and perjury. Decker listed the charges like a grim reaper reading a ledger of sins. Thomas Briggs, your union rep? We arrested him an hour ago for laundering your kickbacks through the union's pension fund. You guys didn't just break the law. You built a cartel behind a badge. Pendleton stared at the indictment. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the weight of an anvil. He wasn't going to a minimum security camp for a quick slap on the wrist. He was looking at federal time, hard time in a penitentiary, where former cops were treated like fresh meat. Agent Decker. Pendleton's voice broke, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. The tough guy facade shattered completely, revealing a pathetic, terrified coward. Please, I have a family. I'll cooperate. I'll give you the names of the other officers involved. I'll give you Captain Miller. Just, please, protect me in there. Behind the two-way glass of the observation room, Richard Hayes stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He watched the man who had terrorized his son beg and sob like a broken child. There was no pity in Richard's eyes, only a cold, clinical satisfaction. Karma had finally come to collect, and the debt was going to be paid in full. The FBI did not stop with Arthur Pendleton. Once the disgraced officer realized he was facing the terrifying prospect of a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, his loyalty to the thin blue line evaporated overnight. Driven by pure self-preservation, Pendleton became the federal government's most valuable, albeit pathetic, asset. For the next 2 months, the Oak Creek Police Department was systematically dismantled from the inside out. Following his tearful confession in Interrogation Room B, Pendleton agreed to wear a covert federal wire into meetings with his superiors. The recordings were damning. They captured Captain William Harrison, a 30-year veteran who had built a career on a tough-on-crime platform, laughing about the illegal impound kickbacks, and openly discussing strategies to falsify police reports to protect his officers from internal affairs complaints. The hammer fell on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 3 months after Donovan had been assaulted in Courtroom 4. District Attorney Gregory Sterling was standing at a mahogany podium in front of City Hall, announcing his candidacy for State Attorney General to a crowd of local reporters. Just as he was promising to clean up the streets, a fleet of unmarked black Subarus pulled onto the plaza. Agent Decker, flanked by 6 armed federal marshals, walked straight up the steps, interrupting the live broadcast. Millions of viewers watched in stunned fascination as Sterling was handcuffed on live television, his political ambitions dying instantly as Decker read him his rights for racketeering, public corruption, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. By the end of the week, 22 officers, 4 dispatchers, the head of the police union, and 3 assistant district attorneys were indicted under the RICO Act. The entire predatory towing operation was seized by the federal government. For the victims of Oak Creek, the exposure of the corruption ring was the dawn of a new era. High-profile civil rights litigator David L. Henderson took on the consolidated cases of the 42 families whose vehicles and livelihoods had been stolen by Pendleton's racket. The city, desperate to avoid a public, drawn-out federal civil trial that would bankrupt their municipality, settled the massive class-action lawsuit for $85 million. As part of the settlement, every single false felony conviction tied to the corrupt officers was overturned and expunged from the public record. 14 months after the slap that echoed through the courthouse, Arthur Pendleton faced his final reckoning. The federal courthouse in the neighboring district was heavily guarded, buzzing with reporters and members of the community who had come to watch the tyrant fall. Pendleton sat at the defense table, but he was unrecognizable from the arrogant, broad-shouldered bully who had terrorized Oak Creek. He was gaunt, his hair had thinned, and he kept his eyes glued to the floor. He wore a shapeless khaki jumpsuit with U.S. Marshal prisoner printed boldly across the back. United States District Judge Samuel V. Hastings, a formidable jurist known for his absolute zero-tolerance policy regarding public corruption, presided over the sentencing. He stared down at Pendleton with undisguised disgust. "Arthur Pendleton," Judge Hastings' voice boomed through the courtroom, heavy with judicial wrath. "You were given a badge, a gun, and the sacred trust of the public. You weaponized that trust to prey upon the most vulnerable members of our society. You targeted young men, you stole their property, and you ruined their futures for your own financial gain. And when a brave young man dared to call out your lies in a court of law, you struck him like a violent street thug." Judge Hastings paused, leaning forward over the heavy wooden bench. "Your cooperation with the federal government is the only reason you are not spending the rest of your natural life behind bars. However, a badge is not a shield against the consequences of your cruelty. It is the judgment of this court that you be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons for a term of 180 months, 15 years. No parole. Furthermore, you are hereby stripped of your municipal pension, which will be liquidated and added to the restitution fund for your victims." Pendleton collapsed into his chair, sobbing into his shackled hands. There was no sympathy in the gallery. There was only the collective exhale of a community finally breathing free air. Pendleton's ultimate karma was realized 2 weeks later when he was transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta. Stripped of his authority, his firearm, and his pride, he was suddenly thrust into a harsh, unforgiving world where former corrupt cops were at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. The man who had once swaggered through the streets as an untouchable king was now relegated to mopping the cafeteria floors, constantly looking over his shoulder, living in a state of perpetual, paralyzing fear. Meanwhile, life for Donovan Hayes blossomed in the sunlight of vindication. With his record completely expunged and a substantial trust fund established from the city's civil settlement, Donovan's dreams were no longer out of reach. He didn't let the trauma of the false arrest break his spirit. Instead, it forged his resolve. On a bright, clear Saturday afternoon in late May, Richard Hayes stood in the driveway of their suburban home, holding 2 cups of coffee. He wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, a rare day off from his demanding role at the bureau. He smiled warmly as he watched his son meticulously buffing the hood of the restored 1998 Honda Civic. The car gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of everything they had fought to protect. Donovan wiped the sweat from his forehead with a microfiber cloth and looked over at his father. The shadow of the bruised, terrified teenager in the orange jumpsuit was completely gone. In his place stood a confident, brilliant young man who had just received his acceptance letter to Georgetown University's pre-law program. "Looks good, D," Richard said, handing his son a coffee. "Thanks, Dad," Donovan replied, taking a sip and leaning against the polished fender. He looked at the quiet, peaceful neighborhood, then back to his father, his eyes filled with profound gratitude. For everything, Richard reached out, clapping a heavy, reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, pulling him into a brief, tight hug. They had walked through the fire together, and they had emerged unbreakable. The gavel's final strike echoed not as a weapon of oppression, but as an instrument of absolute justice. Arthur Pendleton's reign ended in a cold, 6x9 concrete cell, stripped of his badge, pension, and freedom. Meanwhile, Donovan Hayes walked onto his university campus, his young future bright and completely unbroken. True karma is a patient hunter. When it finally strikes, it balances the scales with unforgiving, absolute, and perfect precision.